All right, hello everybody, welcome. Don't want to interrupt anybody, but I'm Mike Wolf. I'm the director of the Mike Downs Center for Indiana Politics, and we're really lucky today to be teaming up with the Indiana Capital Chronicle for this event, which hopefully will be something we do in the future. Just a couple quick thank yous. First to Department of Administration and Buildings and Grounds for getting us up in sound. Brianna from CollegeTV, making sure that we recorded this to beam it out to the people of the state of Indiana. Terry Luce, who helped put this all together, and of course our original director, Andy Downs, who is with us in spirit here. So, but I'm not going to take too long. I want to turn it over to Dan Spieler, who's going to be moderating today, and it's a real pleasure to have him doing so. So thank you.
Thanks, everybody, and good morning. It's great to be here with you today for Organization Day with this really esteemed panel and a great group of people, a great group of minds to talk policy and politics as we gather here today for the start of the new session and Organization Day. Our thanks again to Mike Wolf, to the Mike Downs Center for Indiana Politics, and the Indiana Capital Chronicle for hosting today's event. Let's introduce the panel here real quick. We will have time for questions at the end of the program as well, because I know a lot of people are curious about a lot of topics that may happen at the State House this year. And so to talk about all of that today, we have Niki Kelly, the editor-in-chief from the Indiana Capital Chronicle, Brandon Smith, the State House Bureau Chief from Indiana Public Broadcasting, and from the University of Indianapolis, we have Associate Professor of Political Science, Dr. Greg Shufeldt, and Dr. Laura Wilson. Thanks for being here. Kind of a crossover episode of In Focus, where you sometimes see Laura and I, and Indiana Week in Review, where you'll see Niki and Brandon on PBS. So it's great to have this group here today. We're going to talk about some of the things that the General Assembly is likely to discuss this year, and we'll also talk about some of the things that they're not likely to discuss, in part because it's a short session. It's essentially a lame duck session as it relates to the Holcomb administration now in its final year, and so there are some big issues that will certainly be front and center in the campaign and in the news, even if they're not going to be acted on here this session. But let's start with some of the things that might be acted on and get started kind of with education, because that seems like a topic that may again be a big topic this year. Things like reading proficiency, truancy, childcare. Niki, these are all topics that seem to have lawmakers' interest. What kind of legislation might we see here in the weeks ahead when it comes to education?
Yeah, I think one thing that has popped up sort of suddenly is the issue of truancy or chronic absenteeism. Indiana Department of Education released some data last month and caught, I think, everyone by surprise, including lawmakers. So I know there are legislators right now trying to see what we can do on that, whether it's a carrot, whether it's a stick, whether we need to look into, are prosecutors doing enough locally on truancy? Are schools doing enough? Are we letting DCS know, which they are required by law if you miss a certain number of school days? So I definitely think we'll see a lot on that. I think we've heard a little bit about reading, but we last year put in the science of reading. So that's in the middle of, it's just now starting implementation. I would think they would give that a little bit of time before they make any major changes. It's been a while since I've looked up our law on retention or passing someone through in third grade if they're not up to reading levels. So that could be an area they look at. So I think that's what we're looking at there.
And Brandon, this is something that legislative leaders had a lot to say about yesterday at one of their annual pre-Organization Day events with the Indiana Chamber.
Yeah, I think the message that the Republican legislative leaders gave was, tempering expectations for the 2024 session, and you just talked about how both caucuses mentioned reading proficiency as something that they were going to focus on in the coming session, and yet at the same time you pointed out that they just made this major change in how we teach reading in Indiana, and that's something that Todd Houston in particular talked about is a lot of the big issues that this was all at the Indiana Chamber of Commerce event. A lot of the big issues that the questions from the Chamber of Commerce were focused on were things like childcare, were things like housing, and what Todd Houston's mentioned was, hey, we just passed major bills in 2023 on childcare, on housing, and we have to allow time for those things to take effect to see if they are working before we try and change things up again. So I think that's going to be, there's going to be a push and pull, because for one, it's an election year. You're going to have lawmakers who are going to their constituents saying, look at all the stuff we've done, re-elect us. And if they haven't done it since 2023, that's a harder sell. But at the same time, they don't want to go too far in a short session and risk monkeying up the things they have actually passed.
Right. Laura, when it comes to education, it obviously goes without saying, policy on education impacts workforce, impacts a lot of other aspects of our state's economy and well-being. And again, it seems like that may be a central focus at this session.
Well, absolutely. And you mentioned this is a lame duck administration in terms of the Holcomb administration, but his three, I think, key points as serving as governor have been education, infrastructure, right, and economic development. I don't know what they'll do, especially given this might be a record short session with regards to education. But one thing I'm looking at is the higher education component. We know that increasingly Indiana has lower numbers of high school graduates going on to college. It's obviously a professional interest for us, but also that relates in terms of workforce development. And when you talk about potential economic loomings, whether or not the economy falters in the future, that's when higher education really matters. So I think it'll be interesting to see how those items are addressed, and in particular when Holcomb does his State of the Union and we see what the state legislature does in terms of education and workforce development. Like, where's the relationship there? Where does the state legislature drive that conversation? But what is Holcomb able to address in this last session for him?
Greg, what else are you hearing in terms of education policy, and either in higher education circles or elsewhere, about what we may see or what those in higher education would like to see?
Yeah, I think that there's probably a few different ways to engage them. Sorry about that. That's my fault.
Sometimes it all comes crashing down. Toward the end of the session, that can happen. Yeah.
Is this better? Okay. If every time I speak that tries to happen, I'm just going to take that as a sign and pass the mic along. So for me, I think that I'm interested to see what comes of things that happened last year. So thinking of, for example, record rates of truancy. If we look at potential root causes of that, going after social and emotional learning has potentially roles in that. If we look at curriculum development, as we look at critical race theory and things that popped up last session, where are those sorts of things going to be this year? And so I think that broadly speaks to a culture for how we think about education. And as we focus on the economic development aspect of it, thinking about, is this a state that is training its workers, making them literate, that they want to stick around? So I think that's what I'm kind of focused on.
Some of the issues Greg referenced there, might we see more of those sort of controversial education issues pop up toward the end of session that might delve into more social issues or culture war topics?
Well, not only just education, but the one thing that you can say about these social issues is they don't cost money. And that's what the state doesn't want to spend any money this year, right? We're in a short session. We're not opening the budget. And we will hear that refrain again and again and again. So that does leave some breathing space for some of the more controversial social issues. I don't know if they have a lot of, I guess, appetite for that. I think they want to get in and get out, and they've got their own elections to worry about. So I think we might see minimal, but the fact that most of them aren't financial in nature to the state means that they could pop up.
And Brandon, one issue that sort of delved into this realm last year that popped up was the suggestion to change school board elections to allow candidates to be partisan. That bill failed last year. Might a proposal like that have a better chance of getting through this session?
I mean, we see this with so many issues at the State House. Sometimes it takes years to finally pass a piece of legislation because it makes incremental progress each session. And we've seen that so far with the school board election. We saw the school board election bill, which is it got in the 2022 session, it got a hearing but no vote in committee. And then last year it got a hearing and a vote in committee, but didn't come to the House floor because ultimately the caucus couldn't support a single solution there. Could that go farther? Absolutely. First of all, it will. I would put money on it will be filed. But that's a tricky one, if only because it doesn't fall along the traditional culture war fault lines in the Indiana General Assembly. The reason you see so many of those things move is there is a Republican supermajority. If there were a Democratic supermajority, we'd see the reverse be happening like you do in states like Illinois. But on school boards, that divides people in both parties. Less so Democrats, but certainly Republicans. There are plenty of Republicans in the General Assembly who do not think that school board elections should be politicized in that way. But there are enough, and a growing number, I think, that I think you're going to see that move a little further down the field. I don't know that we can say whether or not it'll happen, but I would be shocked if they don't discuss it pretty heavily.
Like you said, it may not directly touch on the culture wars, but a lot of the scrutiny on school boards and politics has kind of come around because of that.
Absolutely. I think the reason it's gotten more traction now than it ever has in the past is because there has been a concerted focus by particularly arch conservative groups on school board elections across the country. And in Indiana, because we aren't partisan, it's harder for them to gain the sort of traction that they've gained elsewhere.
Niki, while we're over on this side real quick, anything else on the horizon for education that you're watching for?
I think those are the really big ones.
Yeah.
I think they passed that big law last year to reinvent high school. That we're still in early stage of its implementation. Seems like every year there's a workforce development bill, so I'm sure there'll be some sort of workforce development bill with tweaks. But those are the big ones.
Yeah, and like we said, a lot of these topics, workforce, education, these are topics that are also being discussed out on the campaign trail as a number of Republican candidates seek the GOP nomination for governor next year. And of course, because it's a short session, because it's a lame duck session, as we were talking about, a number of big budget items and big ticket items won't be a part of the discussion this year since it's a short session. But there are some big issues these lawmakers and candidates for governor are talking about that could become big issues in the years ahead, and we'll talk about some of those. But first, Greg, broadly speaking here, should we really expect much out of a lame duck session? I know we touched on that here in the opening, but it seems as if this is kind of a session so far, to quote Jerry Seinfeld, could it be a session about nothing?
So I think that's ultimately going to be up to how well organized and disciplined the Republican caucus is. So Indiana is one of 39 trifectas. 81% of us live in a state where one party controls everything. And so it's really about what the leadership does versus what the rank and file do. I think the leadership wants do no harm. Nothing to see here. As soon as this can get over, the more that we can start a new election, a new campaign, a new governor's administration, whereas some of the more individual members might want to go on their own. And so are they empowered to do that? Is there support to do that within the caucus? But my default reaction would be that mostly it's going to be kind of a lot of smoke and mirrors to just kind of get through March.
Laura, you think that's the case, especially as they wait and see who the next governor will be? What kind of agenda will they want to set? As Greg mentioned, sometimes the governor's agenda is or isn't important to lawmakers, but certainly it sets a tone, and they may be, in some cases, waiting to see what the next governor wants to bring.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And to a point Niki made earlier when she said the culture issues are free, I think this will be a short session. We know, obviously, it's a short session, but a shorter session. But to the point of something like that, if you're very disciplined as a caucus, they have every advantage to avoid those kind of issues, to focus on the primary election. You get in, you get out, and then really being able to message themselves in terms of primary voters, especially because it's a relatively non-competitive state. Most of these races are decided in the primary, not the general election. I'd love to go back, though, to the school board piece, because I think this is something that we see like inching towards closer every year in terms of having partisan school board elections. And there were 6 states this last legislative cycle, beyond just Indiana, that introduced legislation in this, even though 41 states have nothing for partisanship in local elections. I could see this one that moves further and further, and much like the Sunday alcohol sales, where it was like every year they'd introduce it, and every year it wouldn't happen.
That took a few years.
It
yeah.
took a few years, and it was just like one of those things you put on your bingo card is like, it's going to be introduced and it's going to fail. I agree with Brandon's assessment. I think this is one that will move a little bit closer, and probably this session too.
See what happens there. As we talk about the agendas of various candidates for governor, one thing that's kind of top of mind on the horizon for 2025 is taxes. We've also had the State and Local Tax Review Study Committee looking at some of the proposals to outright eliminate Indiana's income tax. It's something Lieutenant Governor Crouch has called for in the GOP primary. So it's a big topic here on the campaign trail, but not all of the candidates for governor seem to want to go quite that far with it. But it certainly seems like it could be a pretty big issue here as we look ahead to that horizon for 2025.
Yeah, I mean, the lawmakers aren't going to do anything in 24 because it's a 2-year study.
They're going to keep
and
studying.
They're going to
Yeah.
keep studying it. But the governor's race is making it top of mind. What I have found from a lot of them, even if you go to, for instance, Senator Braun's website, he's got this freedom and opportunity agenda. And it does say stuff like cut taxes, but it doesn't say what tax or how much it would cost or where it would replace it with. And that's what we need to be mindful of as we hear candidates talk about cutting taxes is, what does that mean? What does it mean in relief for taxpayers? Because there are taxpayers who will see relief from it. But what does it mean to the budget? You know, I don't think I think it's disingenuous to throw out a massive tax cut plan with no details of how it will impact the budget. So, but we're starting to hear it. Just last week, Curtis Hill came up with a huge one. I mean, it was like, we're gonna eliminate the income tax for most people. I mean, it was pretty massive. We were gonna cut gas taxes by 16 cents, which is like $500 million.
And he sort of initially pushed back more than anyone else initially at Lieutenant Governor Crouch's proposal, and then came out with a list of other cuts.
So I think the key is to remember we're not going to see that this year, but it is going to be discussed a lot, and it's incumbent on media reporters, journalists to try to get beyond the catchy phrase and talk about the details.
Figure out how you're literally going to pay for it.
Well, and the other thing I'll say is like, for instance, if you look at Suzanne Crouch's proposal, who came out first and said, let's eliminate the individual income tax entirely. That costs something along the lines of $8 billion a year to the state budget. She's also one who has been one of the most outspoken Republicans in Indiana on the critical need for behavioral and mental health services. She's talked a lot about how this has affected her personally and her family. She's been a champion of that, and rightly so. Well, you can't do that if you cut $8 billion out of the state budget. I mean, they barely got $100 million in this last budget, and we have a lot more money than you'd have if you eliminate the income tax. But the thing that strikes me too is the governors, whoever the next governor is, will have their own agenda, obviously, and Eric Holcomb has had a mixed bag of success over what he has tried to pursue in the General Assembly. He's gotten a lot because they were generally things that the Republican supermajorities supported anyway. But some of the trickier stuff he's had trouble getting through. And if you go back to when Mike Pence ran for governor in 2012, he said, I'm going to cut the income tax by 10%. He didn't tell Republican legislative leaders he was going to propose that, and they were never fully on board. They ultimately gave him half of that. So what the governor's candidates say they want and what they will try to pursue does not mean that that's what's going to happen, despite the fact that their party controls the legislature.
And Laura, we've seen that here in recent years, the legislature wanting to not necessarily defer to the governor's agenda. We've seen that, as Brandon mentioned, in a number of different instances, perhaps even more so in recent years.
Well, absolutely. And I think it'll be interesting to see who's elected as our next governor, if they're going to have that kind of acrimonious relationship with the legislature. We saw it with Holcomb during COVID time, right? And if you talk about like the overridden vetoes, again, to the points that have been made, this is the same political party, but obviously different agendas and different priorities. And I think you saw a really conflictual relationship with Mike Pence too, when he was leading the governor's office. So I'd be kind of curious for the new leadership after this election, like how do they work with the legislature and how do they utilize the legislature to be able to pass their agenda. I'm not sure we've seen great examples of that in recent governors. It's hard. That kind of relationship is very difficult.
And of course, both Mike Braun and Suzanne Crouch would come to the governor's office if elected with some legislative experience, Greg, in that she's the LG and presides over the Senate. Mike Braun used to be a state lawmaker. Either of them would bring some of that experience into the State House here if elected.
Yeah, and I think for me, I'm going to say something that in my head already sounds ridiculous, but it's the tension between politics and policy.
Yeah.
Saying that you want to cut taxes by $8 billion is a costless endeavor. You don't have to carry it through.
For the politics side.
For the politics, you get to say it and
Right.
you perhaps can win an election, but it doesn't necessarily have to get translated into policy. And so these proposals might be attractive to primary voters, but they're not necessarily tied to the policy reality. They're not necessarily talking, and I wouldn't anticipate that they'll raise the cigarette tax. I wouldn't anticipate that they'll identify other streams of revenue. And so if you're going to cut that much revenue coming in, you either have to drastically cut spending, you have to identify what you're going to cut, or it's just, again, smoke and mirrors where you can say that this is what you're going to do as a candidate and not necessarily have to carry it out because you know it's not really going to happen.
You mentioned cigarettes and smoke and mirrors. Let's talk about something else that's likely not going to happen this session that gets a lot of buzz, if you will, marijuana legalization. Ohio has now voted to legalize marijuana. And certainly there seems to be more and more interest in at least talking about that here, although Governor Holcomb has said he doesn't want to do it. Some in this primary, Senator Braun has hinted he might be open to medicinal marijuana potentially, but how will this session's discussion go on this topic, do you think, Niki? And is this just another issue that's probably going to have to wait until a future session in all likelihood?
Yeah, they're not gonna do marijuana A in a short session and B under Holcomb. I do think the next governor might have a little more sway on that. Although I got to be honest, most of the lawmakers I talk to still are not supportive of it. They point toward the negative impacts of society, you know, that we see in other states that have legalized. So while there are some more vocal people, numbers-wise, I still think there are far more who just are not interested in legalizing marijuana anyway.
Yeah, and as you said, Niki, it's not just Governor Holcomb, it's also legislative leadership.
Yeah,
on the Republican side.
Todd Houston said yesterday when asked about this, he's still looking for someone to tell him what the benefit of legalizing cannabis is, and no one has been able to do that. I mean, there are people who have that answer. I guess he's not happy with the answers he's heard. But more than waiting for the next governor, which I do think the legislature can do, although it amuses me that the legislature on cannabis is paying attention to what the governor thinks and says when clearly on other issues they don't care. But I think there's an increasing tension between, especially if somehow Joe Biden wins a second term. It looks increasingly likely that the federal government will try to deschedule marijuana. And that's what a lot of Indiana leaders have been saying they're waiting for.
Holcomb's always pointed to that.
Holcomb's pointed to that.
Right.
Previous leaders of the General Assembly and current leaders of the General Assembly continue to point to that. Well, the problem is if you wait for that to happen and you've established no sort of framework for how legal cannabis will exist in this state, you're creating chaos. Because now it's not illegal federally, but it's illegal here, and yet it's legal in almost all of the surrounding states. As Greg Taylor said yesterday, Indiana now has a contact high from cannabis. You're creating a chaotic situation for yourself. So I don't think anything will happen this year. I think they'll talk more, and this is another one of those issues that takes years as they get more and more comfortable with the idea. But I think, especially in 2025, depending on who's in the White House, they may have almost no choice but to try and at least do something so that they are saving themselves from a potentially chaotic situation.
I guess this would be a good time to remind people there are snacks in the back of the room as well, if anyone is hungry. Politically, just a quick aside, politically, Laura, this issue certainly, and Greg, you made the point about separating politics and policy. Policy could be complicated on this issue, but politically it seems in every state it's gone to the ballot or been polled, that the general will of the people in most states has been to legalize marijuana.
And that's true, and there are 23 states that have legalized it for recreational use, but we don't have direct democracy here, so
Right.
in this case it doesn't really matter what the voters think in that way. Kayla Dwyer wrote a piece for the Star yesterday talking about where the gubernatorial candidates stood on this, and Rainwater and McCormick were both in favor of legalizing, and all of the Republican candidates were opposed, that were on the record. I think Braun didn't directly respond to that.
I asked Braun about it actually yesterday, and he did again sound open to medicinal marijuana, which is also what Kentucky's doing. He's from Jasper. He might be willing to take that step potentially.
A yes, no, right? Like
Yeah.
a sort of, but a non-committal in terms of the recreational. And I don't think it's, I mean, I agree with everything. I don't think it's going to happen this year. You would only have anything to lose. And if you're a legislator, if you're in the House, it's your seat. If you're in the Senate, it might be your seat, depending if you're up for re-election. I think it is going to be the issue that keeps coming up, especially because it's happened at the state. But Brandon's point in terms of federalism is really good. So far, the leadership has punted it, saying, well, we're not going to do it until the federal government does it. But what happens with that moment? I agree. Chaos.
Yeah, Greg, what do you make of the intersection of politics and policy here on this issue?
Yeah, I'd echo what everybody else says, that nothing's really going to come of this. I hesitate to think of the Republican primary voter or the Republican voter that this is going to be the issue that's going to change their vote. So no legislator is really facing any sort of consequences for not following public opinion on this. And so it's safe politically and from a policy perspective. If you're not sure, or if it's your sincere belief, there's no real push yet, I think, to change it.
Okay, another topic that came up when lawmakers met yesterday and sort of fits into this category of things that aren't likely to happen this year seems to be gaming issues. And obviously there's been a good bit of controversy in the news recently about former State Representative Eberhardt and some of the troubles that he's faced because of prior legislation. And it seemed yesterday that Republican legislative leadership almost wanted to take a hands-off approach to any gaming legislation this session, perhaps because of the controversies some of these bills have created in the past.
Oh, more than that. I mean, we asked Speaker Todd Huston and Senate President Pro Tem Rod Bray yesterday, does the Eberhardt guilty plea and the potential promise of more to come on that eliminate the possibility of any gaming legislation in the 2024 session? They said, absolutely yes. You will not see anything move in 2024. But then I pushed further and said, because in this realm, we just had a major gaming debate earlier this year, which is the state going to finally allow online gaming in a table game sort of space? So we have online sports gaming, but we don't have anything further than that that's legal. And there was a lot of momentum going into the 2023 session that we would legalize online gaming through the casinos. We would move the lottery online, not entirely move it online, but we would allow the lottery to be sold online. And it fell apart because of industry issues primarily. But that was expected to come back. Again, as you're talking about the building momentum for bills over several sessions. This now makes it very difficult to do that in the near future, not just in 2024, but in 25 or 26 or 27, because as Rod Bray talked about, it makes it a lot harder to have the trust of Hoosier voters that what you're doing is on the up and up.
It's certainly been a big topic and a big controversy. Greg, you've got a thought on this as well.
Yeah, and I would also jump in that to me it's interesting or perhaps disappointing that the default reaction is just to slow down gambling issues, but not to push through anything on transparency or good government or anything like that to try to restore the trust. It's just kind of a wait and see, not necessarily taking proactive steps to clean up some of these processes, to clean up money in politics. It's an opportunity that I feel like is kind of wasted right now.
And Laura, as Brandon alluded to, it's certainly a controversy that could continue to snowball potentially, because it's an issue that can be fraught with different situations that might cross the line legally.
Oh, absolutely. And you have the legal component, and you also have the moral component, and we are the heart of the Bible Belt, as is so evident by many of the topics we've already discussed. And I think that's part of what comes into the gaming question and the gambling question. I'd emphasize what Dr. Shufeldt said in terms of the question of transparency. Like, there's no push for we should hold elected leaders more accountable. We should understand more what's going on. This is much more, we'll punt it down the road, we'll wait till people have forgotten. And voters do tend to have short-term memories, so I guess that's what we're kind of betting on. Ironic use of words there. But but I don't know that's what we should be doing in terms of good governance. I'm not sure that's the right play.
Another issue that came up yesterday and sort of relates to transparency to some degree, the LEAP controversy, which continues up in Boone County and in West Lafayette, where the county commissioners just yesterday enacted an ordinance trying to push back against this LEAP plan to pipe water from the Wabash River up in the Lafayette area down to Boone County for a new innovation district. It seems as if water could be kind of a hot topic, potentially legislation. The legislature may have to act simply to undo the local ordinance that Tippecanoe County just put into place yesterday.
Yeah, there are multiple legislators who've said they are going to file legislation more likely to not necessarily ban it, but to somehow make more transparent large withdrawals. Maybe you have to get permission first, something like that. I think leaders made it clear yesterday that they're not interested in that they don't want to handicap this project in any way. And this is one that we'll see where Governor Holcomb's status lies in his lame duck year, because they have everything riding on this project. And yes, even if they say we don't necessarily need the water unless we get one of these huge, semiconductor chip plants. But that was the whole purpose of the plant, was to get a huge semiconductor chip plant. So they do need the water. So I think it'll be interesting to see how much water the legislature carries for Governor Holcomb on that. Swear to God, I didn't plan that. It was terrible.
How many puns can we put together today, right?
Yeah. So that one is going to be pretty incredible to watch go through. I know Democrats are definitely frustrated with the IEDC. They always were. I'm hearing more grumbles than I used to about Republicans being frustrated with transparency in the IEDC. So we'll see, if not the water side.
And it's an issue that kind of touches on the governor's race as well. Brad Chambers was recently the head of the IEDC. Eric Doden was once as well.
Yeah, although they've taken very divergent views of the LEAP proposal. Obviously, Chambers in favor of it. Eric Doden very much not so far, at least in the way it's been rolled out. But more than that, I think this gets to a larger issue that we've seen bubbling up in the General Assembly among Republicans for a few years now, which is increasing dissatisfaction of Republican lawmakers towards state agencies in general. That they feel like they are overburdensome on the average citizen.
And that's sort of a national political trend in large part,
but
too.
We've seen it in action here, where they have tried to handicap their rulemaking. They've tried to have more control over the rules and fines and fees that state agencies are able to levy on the average person, or really businesses, because that's what a lot of this comes down to. So I think the IEDC has kind of been able to be above that, because they don't interact with businesses the way that a lot of other agencies do. But on this issue, I think it's an outgrowth of that. The Republican lawmakers are a little less willing to give a Republican-controlled state agency any sort of rope on the decisions that seem to be unpopular with some of their constituents.
And Greg, this is an issue that touches on a topic I know you wanted to talk about, issues of local control. And we've sort of seen that here in the legislature in recent years, where there have been issues where maybe a local government entity and the state don't see eye to eye, and who gets the local control? Does the state take it from the local municipalities? We've seen different issues in Indianapolis, and this is an issue too that kind of touches on that topic.
Yeah, and so local preemption is something that is really on the rise in Indiana. Sorry, is this better?
Yeah.
Sorry. Local preemption is something that's on the rise in Indiana, but across the 50 states as well. So we've seen it with legislation related to that the city council passed on gun control. We've seen this on debates on no right turn on red lights. We've seen this on raising the minimum wage, that local governments can't do that. And so water is just kind of the next line on this. And this is something that we're really going to see with one party controlling state government, that it isn't necessarily sincere thoughts on federalism about local control is better or federal control is better. It's we have all of the power, we don't want to share it with anybody. And so we're seeing this in one party controlled states across the country. And
Laura, we've seen a number of issues, as Greg mentioned, that kind of touch on this local control, and sometimes local control is kind of held up as something that they want to champion in the legislature, and sometimes, as Greg mentioned, it maybe isn't.
Well, it's kind of ironic if you look at Dillon's Law or Home Rule. In Indiana, by and large, our local governments don't have much control relative to the state constitution if you compare across 50 other states. And sometimes it feels like things that are relatively innocuous, like water supply is different, but pet sales. It wasn't a problem when Carmel made a decision on it, but when Indianapolis did, all of a sudden the state was much more involved and invested in this kind of policy. I think you do have that tension between the state government and the city in this, but the challenge, if you don't give your city much control, it emphasizes that antagonism. And I do think the local preemption issues will be very interesting. Again, to a point Niki made really early on, these don't cost you anything. They could be helpful in the primary for voters, certainly. And I don't think it's an issue that's going to go away.
Yeah, and here in Indianapolis, we may see more disputes up and down Market Street. This year, Mayor Hogsett just reelected, but obviously the legislature in recent years has taken a focus on a lot of things happening in Marion County when it comes to the prosecutor's office, when it comes to other items in city government as well.
Well, I think the prosecutor issue is done for a little while. This was something that, a couple of state lawmakers in the Senate were really unhappy with Ryan Mears in Marion County and over the things he was and was not willing to prosecute.
Whose opponent in his last election, by the way, is now in the state legislature.
He's now in the
Cindy
state
Carrasco.
Senate, that's
Yeah.
correct. And that really and they tried to do something to it where they basically would take over his prosecution of cases in certain areas, and the House Republicans were really unwilling to go along with that for a long time. And again, I keep coming back to this theme of it takes several sessions for something to happen. Last session, they finally did something where the Prosecutors Association now, or the council, can now, if a prosecutor is categorically not enforcing certain laws, can take over special prosecution of those cases. I don't know if they ever will, but I don't see that bubbling up again. Although, in terms of that local preemption stuff, I think something obvious that will definitely get debated and may even get to the finish line finally after years of not making it there is PLAs at the local level. So this is local governments have the option, they are not required to, of making public construction projects union only. Only union shops can bid for those jobs. Generally speaking, that means higher wages for the workers on those jobs, but of course that also means higher costs for the project. And Republicans, particularly Jerry Torr in the House, who is in his last session, this in 2024, have been trying to eliminate those entirely for years, not even allow local governments that option. And it's important to note that local mayors of both parties, Republican and Democrat, have habitually come down to the State House and said, please don't do this, we want this option. But they've continued to push it. It's been stymied in the Senate every single time. I think it'll come back. The Chamber of Commerce has put it on their agenda for this session, so they're going to be pushing it a little harder. I think that's another tension between not just democratically controlled cities, though. That's, I think, what's important to remember on that topic. This is something that both parties across the state don't want, but enough Republican lawmakers may finally agree to.
All right. Well, in a moment, we're going to be taking some questions here from those of you who've come out to listen to today's discussion. But before we do, I want to talk about any other issues on the horizon. And one that I had written down that we wanted to talk about, too, was one that's being discussed in local government and the federal government, too, and that's artificial intelligence. Seems to be a big topic everywhere these days. Niki, do you think the Summer Study Committee's discussion on this issue might lead to any new legislation here this year?
Yeah, I think the Summer Study Committee identified a few areas where they could more likely clarify the law to make sure it takes into account artificial intelligence. I don't think it's going to be any sort of massive, bold legislation, but, some tweaks. I do think one other area we might see is some movement in childcare. They created a tax credit last year, but it was only a couple $1 million for employer-sponsored childcare. That's not going to solve our childcare problem. And the childcare committee actually came up with a lot of recommendations too, some of which involve basically just lessening regulations on childcare, companies or businesses or people who do it in their homes. So I think we might see something there.
Brandon?
One issue that I can't guarantee will actually come to anything, but I think will have to be discussed, and it's another topic of a summer study committee in which they actually did pass a recommendation, which is increasingly notable because most of them don't anymore. But it's support for public pension retirees. So for the first time in literally decades, in the 2023 budget, lawmakers did not include either a cost of living adjustment or what's called a 13th check for retirees, which is an extra month of pension benefits. And that shocked, quite frankly, a lot of people, because there has been a push and pull between the House and the Senate for years over which option they prefer, the 13th check or the COLA. And so a summer study committee this year looked at that and said, what is the best way to stop doing this every budget cycle and actually put in something permanent and long-term for these public pension retirees, of which there are around 100,000 in the state? But they still haven't talked about doing anything right now to help those people who didn't get any help in 2023 and therefore wouldn't be getting any help in 2024. And you talk about they don't want to spend any money, and that's true, but the money is already there. There is money sitting in an account that will not otherwise be used by anything else if they wanted to do the 13th check or a small COLA. And there will be pressure on lawmakers to at least do something in the short term before they come up in 2025 with a long-term solution.
There are sometimes those issues that touch on budget-related items where they say, we don't want to reopen the budget, but maybe there are small measures they can take to clarify. And I wonder if the controversy over reimbursement rates for autism therapy, I know that's been in the state budget committee. Is that something we might see lawmakers act on? Hard to say at this point, but again, it's one of those that they might say, that would involve opening up the budget.
Yeah, that would have far greater budgetary consequences, and I don't think they'll want to go that far. I think they're going to, again, say, well, let's wait until 2025 when we write a new budget and figure out how to do all of that holistically.
Yeah. Laura, Greg, before we take questions, anything else on the horizon for you in this session or as we look out onto the campaign trail for 2024 and 2025?
Well, you already said AI, and half the states last year introduced legislation. 15 states passed it. I'm definitely watching that, and that was an important summer study session. I think any of the wedge issues, though they may not be addressed, we had book banning, we had critical race theory, we had questions in terms of the LGBTQIA plus community. If anything like that comes up, and whatever happens in the state legislature, I feel like we will be asking gubernatorial candidates, so
That's
where
right.
do you stand on this issue? What
Will
would
you support
do?
it? Would you not? Would you veto it? Right.
And I think that is up to an active press and an engaged voter base to ask those questions, to have that kind of follow-up, to interrogate our candidates in that way.
Greg?
Yeah, I think for me, the thing that I'm most interested in seeing, what I feel pretty confident won't happen, is any movement on direct democracy or the initiative here. So about 24, 25 states have the citizen initiative. Indiana's not one of them.
And we saw what just happened in Ohio on marijuana and abortion.
And it's quite rare for a state to add that. The states that have it, it was part of their state constitution when they were founded, or it was part of when they revised their state constitution largely during the populist progressive era at the turn of the century. No states are adding this, and in fact, many states are making it harder. And so while there's a push for it, citizens look around Ohio, they look at Michigan and see that the benefits of this, that it allows you to kind of, from an a la carte place, pick policies that you want. I don't see much movement happening on that.
The Ohio legislature, as a matter of fact, exploring if there's anything they can do to wind back perhaps some of the votes that were taken this past year on the ballot initiative. So we're not going to talk about the Ohio legislative session for sure, but as it relates to the session coming here, we'd like to open it up now to questions, and Mike will be able to help facilitate that. Mike will have the mic, and we'll pass around our mic here as we look for questions out in the audience for our panel today. Did we cover it all? Somebody's got to have a question, right?
There are a lot of journalists in this
There are
office.
journalists
Let's go.
in this
Come on,
room.
guys.
Abdul's not here to ask the first question, as he often is wont to do. There we go.
Hi, thank you for being here. You touched a little bit on the anti-LGBTQ legislation. Do you think there's any chance we're going to see that come back for this short session?
I'll answer if they
Rand.
want to.
Yes. 1,000% yes. In part because it's an election year. In part because Increasingly, the only real elections that matter when it comes to the Indiana General Assembly are primary elections for both parties. And you're playing to a very small base of the populace in trying to win a primary election. If you're a Republican, you're not going to be primaried from the left, you're going to be primaried from the right. And the people and the issues that seemingly play to that crowd are culture war issues. So they've done things the last couple of sessions, a lot last session in 2023. I expect them, some of that is hung up in court. That will not stop Republicans. It never has on these sorts of issues before. It doesn't stop Democrats in democratically controlled states. I would expect something. It could be something along the lines of banning gender-affirming care for all people, not just those under the age of 18. It could be something along the line of a public drag ban, which essentially bans transgender people from being in the public sphere. We're going to see it. I don't know that it'll get passed, but there will be things that are filed, and I expect them to be seriously considered, especially as we talked about in the beginning of this conversation. In the vacuum of major, serious policy discussions, there is the space that is opened up for that stuff.
So the session about nothing I alluded to, that never actually happens.
It never actually happens. I mean, we were talking about this beforehand. Going back to trying to figure out the last time we had a true lame duck session for a governor. In 2016, that wasn't true with Mike Pence because we didn't realize he was going to be leaving to run for vice president. So you have to go back to Mitch Daniels in 2012. And in the 2012 session, we passed right to work. So there's never nothing.
Right. You may have to go back 8 more years to a lame duck session. Niki, any other thoughts on that question?
No, I think you've got that one.
Any other questions out there? Yes.
Speaking of vacuums, you've touched a little bit on the LEAP project, but what else do you see coming down the pike regarding environmental issues for this session?
We've been fighting, well, there's been an argument over wetlands for several years. I wouldn't be surprised at all to see that. And short session's a pretty good time to do sort of wetlands issues or environmental issues, utility issues. So I would definitely think we will probably see some wetlands movement.
And then speaking of water, yesterday PFAS
also
came up.
I was interested to see that from the Chamber of Commerce. They put on their agenda this year that they want to see, so far the legislature has passed some bills related to PFAS, but only as it regards like firefighters and firefighter equipment and things. The Chamber wants to see it expanded because those are in a lot more than just what firefighters wear and use. They want to see legislation address PFAS in a much broader fashion. Now, I think from the Chamber's perspective, they want some clarity as to what they can and can't do with PFAS, but not that the Chamber of Commerce dictates everything the General Assembly does. Increasingly, in a lot of issues, they don't. But I think on this one, that will elevate it to where a lot of lawmakers have already been thinking about, and so that's one area I think we might see them delve into.
Any other questions?
Yep, I got one.
There we go. Yeah, I didn't see you had the microphone. Sorry.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
my question is actually more about how the body of the legislature has changed, because we have at least 5 different faces, new faces, all through caucuses. One of the things I wanted to ask was whether you thought any loss of certain leadership positions would change conversations that we hear, and number 2, whether that caucus, the pace of retirement is a lot faster than you've seen in prior sessions, and whether we need to rethink how these replacements are appointed through caucuses.
That's been a big topic here in recent years because we've seen so many.
So she asked about the pace of retirements and resignations we're seeing in the legislature. And first of all, whether we'll notice any large change. I mean, we did see a few immediate resignations, none that I think will impact the body as a whole. And then on top of that, we're seeing lots of people saying they're not running for re-election next year. Having been around this since 2000, I think every time the re-election cycle comes up, we see a bunch start to happen and we think, wow, this is moving really fast. But in the end, it ends up being about average. So I'm not convinced yet that we're seeing an above average amount of decisions to not seek re-election. I think there's always a cycle where some of the older members or members who are just tired of it decide they're going to move on. So at least so far, I don't think we're seeing more than past.
Yeah, because it's the time of year, I looked up over the last decade. Over the last decade in each election cycle, every 2-year election cycle, we've had about 11 state lawmakers who decide not to run for re-election or another office. We've only hit 3 or 4 so far this cycle. Now we will get more as the filing deadline approaches in February, but I think more of the light this year has been shining on people who are just immediately leaving the legislature and then have to be caucused in by whichever party they're in. There has seemed to be a bit of a spike in that. We've hit 6 this year. One because Eddie Melton became the mayor of Gary. Another because Jack Sandlin unfortunately passed away. But the others were just, they decided they didn't want to be in the legislature anymore. And in some cases, with 3 years left on a 4-year Senate term.
And Laura, this is something we've talked about on In Focus. It does seem to be happening more and more, and there's sometimes a little bit of a pushback to it or a scrutiny to the system and the process then for which how lawmakers are then put into place, especially when it happens, as Brandon mentioned, early into someone's term.
Well, exactly, because then your replacement is not going to the voters to select, but it's going to the party caucus, right? So they are able to retain a little bit more control. And I think when you look at this, Jerry Torr is a loss of leadership, but we tend to be pretty average in terms of the amount of turnover. And it's really hard. We don't have term limits in our state legislature, and incumbency advantage is incredibly high. So if you don't have competition in your primary, unless you want to leave, you're pretty much set to be reelected. And I think the balance of institutional memory in our state legislature feels very strong. It feels nationally in terms of that average there.
Greg?
Yeah, and I think that the support for process-related change, changing this, making it a process that you and I as voters get to play in, support for that might be growing, but this is the sort of thing that state legislators and party caucuses don't give that power away. This is the type of reform that would happen if we had the initiative, right? So states are more likely to implement term limits. They're more likely to implement open primaries, things like that, that parties might not want, but without that, parties aren't going to just give that power away.
Any other questions before we wrap things up? We've got one more out there in the crowd in the middle there, Mike.
I'm actually going to stand up because
Yeah.
I'd like to ask you guys this and, look you in the eye. What would you say to the people here today, they're the best way to advocate for themselves during the legislation?
So that's actually, I'm going to make a little plug for something Indiana Public Broadcasting is currently doing. We have a project, a team project that we've recently instituted called Civically Indiana. Look up Civically Indiana at ipbs.org/Civically Indiana, where we're trying to answer the questions we get from our audience. And that is one of the questions we get the most, which is, what is the best way for me to talk to my lawmaker? And quite frankly, I don't have a good answer for you yet, because certain lawmakers respond to different things. So that some respond more to the emails they get. Some respond more to the phone calls they receive. Some respond more to what they refer to as third house meetings, which are held during the session, which is on the weekends when they go home to their districts. Some of them, not all of them, have what they call third house meetings where people can come out and ask them questions and they'll talk to them. And that is a great opportunity to speak face to face with the people who represent you, but not all of them do it. Some of them respond to people showing up at the State House for a committee hearing saying, I'm your constituent, I care about this issue, and testifying in committee, which is open generally to anyone. But there's not one answer to that question. If you have the time and the energy and the know-how, doing all of them certainly helps, but most people don't have the time and the energy and the know-how to do all of those things or even one of those things. So unfortunately, I can't give you the straightest answer you might like, but that is the most honest answer I can give.
Well, and I think being here to testify at the State House for any citizen who's interested in a particular piece of legislation is important, not only to have your voice be heard by lawmakers, but also by those of us in the press who might be covering that particular piece of legislation, who don't want to hear only from lawmakers, but also from real people, from citizens, and how laws might affect them. It's important for the press to hear from those people as well, I think.
I would say putting aside the very top, like an abortion bill or a transgender health care bill, where members are going to go in with their minds made up. But the other 95% of bills that are more everyday, less controversial, they respond to you coming to a hearing and speaking to their face directly. Now, again, I'm going to say a few of the very, very controversial ones.
Some of those have time limits and 100
Exactly.
people who are going to testify.
But on sort
right.
of more basic, everyday bills impacting Hoosiers, that is what they like.
Mostly I just really want to emphasize advocating for yourself, and people like you on these panels. I think it's really important for us to give people hope, and so talking to them about what they can do, even if they're not listening, I think is really important. And so I just really want to hear you guys kind of clarify that for us, so that we can also feel good about what we're doing.
Right. Thanks. It's a great point.
I'll just respond to that only in saying, my job is not to give you hope. My job is to tell you the truth.
Right.
And that Venn diagram doesn't overlap a whole lot.
Abdul, you had a question. Do you need a mic? You may need a microphone. We did invoke your name earlier.
One question. This is particularly for Brandon specifically. What issue do you see not popping up this session that lawmakers want nothing to do with?
Eric Berman, who showed up late and missed the 4 questions we already wrote about. Sorry. We're not
We
doing
went through a few
marijuana, we're
topics,
not
yeah.
doing gaming, we're not doing tax reform. There you go.
Any other questions? Our thanks to all of you for being here and to our great panelists. Please give it up for Niki Kelly, Brandon Smith, Greg Shufeldt, Laura Wilson. Great to have them all here. Great to have you here as well. Thanks for being a part of this discussion today. And again, thanks to the Mike Down Center for Indiana Politics and the Indiana Capital Chronicle for putting this on. We do have snacks in the back, as I mentioned earlier, in one of our many legislative funds. And hey, watch Indiana Week in Review and In Focus this week to hear more about Organization Day and the race for governor and all the things going on in Indiana politics. Thanks, everybody. Take care.